Hello, everyone. I'm Gabrielle Starr, president of Pomona College, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the final dialogue in our series of this year. So much has happened since we began this series in fall 2020. We saw the pandemic rise to astonishing levels before reliable vaccines became available. We witnessed violent insurrection at the United States Capitol. State governments have passed oppressive legislation restricting voting rights. Domestic terrorism and hate crimes have shaken our communities with what I hope is shocking frequency. And all of this has taken place during a time when we all are feeling incredible isolation and loneliness. Never has the challenge to cultivate an inclusive and empathetic community been more important. And as we turn our eyes to this coming fall in the hope of coming together once again, which we will, we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do to reimagine our Pomona College community after having been apart for so long in such trying times? So our closing event brings together an extraordinary professor and an extraordinary student, both of whom are also representative of the ordinary beauty of our community. And joining me in this discussion is Kevin Wynter, Assistant Professor of Media Studies, and Pomona Senior Hershey Kaur Suri, who serves as the ASPC Vice President of Student Affairs. Professor Wynter is a film and media scholar whose work has at its core a concern for relationality, an issue of paramount importance in our increasingly networked and technological world. Ms. Suri has been both an active participant and a leader in Pomona's Sustained Dialogues initiative, which seeks to establish meaningful ongoing conversations that transform conflict and the relationships that underpin conflict to cultivate understanding. And I am grateful to both of you for joining me today. This is very exciting. So this has been a year that has been full of beauty in many ways. As much as it's hard to say that, but it's been so full of just pain and difficulty too. And so Hershey, would you mind starting us off and just giving us some thoughts about from where you sit in your life and in your roles, your various roles as student, as a family member, as human, what this has meant for you?
Right. So a little bit of background on myself before I start this tumultuous year that I've been engaged in. So I grew up as a first-generation American. My parents are both from India. And I grew up as a Gursikh in this country. So my parents are Sikhi. My father has a turban and a beard. My brother has a turban and a beard. I've never cut my hair, so I have a very extensive, lot of split ends, but I grew up having to educate everyone in my neighborhood, in my society, around who I was and what my religion was, just because also I was born in New York during the time of 9/11, which was something that I had to grow up witnessing with my father, especially as he navigated these various societies. So I always grew up thinking that education and dialogue and speaking was the way that I not only communicated about how to bring communities together and how to foster understanding, but it was also survival a little. It was a way for me to advocate for people of my community, but then also just advocate for my family. And when that was my college essay. And then I got into Pomona, and I didn't really know how much that would resonate with me over the past 4 years here. I have felt that at the Claremont colleges specifically, but at Pomona, that I've still had to educate my community. Still not a lot of people know what Sikhism is. And they have questions, or sometimes I feel like people are afraid to ask questions, which hurts me even more. And I think that's a result and accumulation of the last 4 years, 5 years. I think that with heightened tensions in this country, as well as trauma that's been inflicted over generations of different minority groups and underrepresented groups being afflicted by policies and genocide and history. And genocide, I mean taking various different forms. It has become clear to me that it's hard for people to not just talk about their identity and talk about their past trauma, but advocate for themselves and other communities. And so I think for me, launching the Sustained Dialogue Initiative occurred over the summer of last year. That was during a time where we across the globe were having conversations about what it was, what did it mean to be a part of a progressive society? What does it mean that we're moving forward? Because even though it has been like 200, 300 years since slavery has ended, that does not mean by any means that things have changed. They've just taken different forms. And that's not just with slavery, that's with so many different forms of oppression in this country, because quite honestly, I'm a politics major as well, this country was built on the principles of white Christian males. So obviously that's the group that's going to be put on the pedestal and prioritized in very underlying ways in our society. So with the Sustained Dialogue Initiative, the point was to address these issues within the student body, within the staff, within the administration, and within faculty, and bring us together as a community to talk about them. Because I think at the end of the day, the one thing that we can all agree on is that we are human. We are human, and we have a lot of underlying similarities that if we actually sit down to talk about, I think we'd find ourselves agreeing a lot more than disagreeing. But with the political climate, with the trauma that so many individuals have endured, and with the understanding that sometimes you're not going to get what you want, it is hard to have that dialogue, and it's hard to sit down and talk. And so that's why myself, along with Dean Eisenberg and Pi, who is the ASPC president, we're just, let's start this. Let's try to get this conversation going. We've heard Sustained Dialogue Initiative has been like great in the past. And now we have 4 to 5 actually, Sustained Dialogue groups that range from different topics concerning my Sustained Dialogue group currently that I'm leading with Dean Eisenberg is on building trust between faculty, staff, and students. And what does it mean to build trust at Pomona? We have the first ever student trustee Sustained Dialogue group in the country.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a second and say this is the first ever, not for Pomona, but this Sustained Dialogue Initiative was founded in the aftermath of World War II. Mm-hmm. This is the very first time that students, faculty, staff, and trustees in the entire history of this program have come together.
Yeah.
That's at Pomona.
Exactly. I really want to credit Pi and Christina for doing this. They're the ones in charge of that group. And we have a Black student Sustained Dialogue group led by Black student facilitators. We have a Sustained Dialogue group looking at LGBTQ identities on campus. And it is fundamentally been amazing to be a part of this process, just because it also equips students, faculty, and staff with the tools to not just understand where different people and different perspectives are coming from, but also as a community crafts how we can move forward with action steps to then address these in a larger setting, which is quite like how we as a community end up attacking the issues that lay underneath the surface.
And it's also what we hope for our students beyond graduation, that in our time here together, we gain tools and possibilities to transform things. And Professor Wynter, I'm interested in anything you have to say, but listening to Hershey and hearing her story, the connection, people often will say that when individuals talk about trauma, what does that mean? And the term microaggressions, though it has a sustained history and research, is often interpreted or can be interpreted as something small.
Right.
Really micro, that's what it means. But on the other hand, we talk about trauma as this encapsulating and really devastating kind of experience. So for those of our community who are trying to think about the relationship, what it means to encounter ideas traumatically, I would love to hear what you have to say about that, and also about how your understanding of or representations of trauma in the media help us to understand or misunderstand what it means to come to knowledge through trauma.
That's a great question. First, let me say, Hershey, that was a remarkable narrative that you just provided about what you've experienced in the past year, and I'm just astounded. I'm not even 5 minutes into this, and I'm absolutely astounded. So that was wonderful. So that's a really great question, Gabby. I think when I think back to this past year, and I think about how we've all had to kind of collectively face trauma on a number of fronts, particularly around police brutality, the visibility of racial disparities in this country, and how those disparities tend to be articulated, particularly in the media, how we come to face these disparities, how they become legible to us. That has in part defined much of what's happened over the past year, I think. If we think back in this past year and we try to understand what's been going on in this past year, the pandemic has been one part of it, but also there has been really, I think, a spike in terms of how we've understood race relations in this country and the power disparity between racial disparities in this country. So that's one thing. In terms of thinking about how we collectively face trauma, one of the things that really stands out to me when I think back to this past year, especially how the pandemic has caused us to drive a wedge between us, has caused us in many ways to have to be physically distanced from each other, is that in spite of the necessity for us to have to maintain distance from each other, we've also been called to collectively come together, to collectively face issues around kind of traumatic revelations, particularly around racial disparities and again, the power disparity between races in this country. And so I think back to the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. And I recall seeing on the news, particularly around the LA area, when people started to go out into the streets to protest. And I found it really intriguing that part of the concern was that social distancing measures weren't being maintained, yet at the same time, there was a kind of necessity for people to collectively come together to make known their disgust for what had been taking place and the continuing police brutality in this country as a way to try to push back against that. So in terms of thinking about trauma, I find it fascinating that on the one hand, the pandemic is itself a kind of traumatic experience that we've all had to collectively deal with. And part of addressing that is to remain physically distanced from each other in order to try to slow down the spread. Yet at the same time, while another trauma is occurring on another front, we are being called collectively to come together to face that physically as one. So that's really, I think, been one of the most striking things to me about the visibility of trauma through the media, the visibility of trauma in society in the past year, and how that there's at its core this kind of paradox. On the one hand, we have to remain physically distanced to deal with one traumatic episode, yet at the same time, we have to come together physically and collectively to beat back another kind of traumatic experience. So that's been one of the more fascinating things to me about trauma, the visibility of trauma in the past year.
Kevin, you put your finger on something very important there, which is what I'm hearing in part is different understandings of what it means to be part of a collective experience. And that we need to share our experiences to make some form of collective as human beings. Not to say that we're not individuals and don't vary one from the other, but that we are social beings. And we need to make sense of things collectively. And on one hand, we need to have needed to and continue to make sense of the collective need for distance so we can survive this. but the inability of us fully to be either a collective or an individual. I remember years ago when I was a kid, my best friend gave me a copy of Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Flamingo Smile. And the operative story was about eugenics and how eugenics just wasn't real. That inheritance and genetics, you can't predict human life from it. And the jellyfish was the kind of proto-organism. It's an individual and a colony. And how do we understand that network of connection that is us and everybody else? It's hard. And part of the biggest thing about college, Hershey, I have felt, is that we try so hard to make sense of who we are in all of the different communities in which we live. So, and you also try to represent everybody as an ASPC. That's a hard task.
That is hard. And even when I was running, I think it's interesting every ASPC election. I think it's interesting because a lot of platforms really represent the communities that people are from on campus. And as you mentioned, like everyone's a part of various communities on campus. But when I was running, I never tried to say that I was going to be an advocate for a community because I was from that community. I was always on the line of, I will be an advocate for your community because I will be an advocate for your community. I'm not an advocate for my community, the sick community, because I am sick. I'm an advocate for my community because I want to stand with them and advocate for them and help educate the world about them. I don't think that I think being an advocate in itself requires a commitment to moving forward with that identity as a collective. And in that saying, I believe that advocacy doesn't even have to stay with one group of people. And as both of you were saying, when we think about the collective, we have to, we acknowledge our differences. We acknowledge the fact that we come from different spaces, from different languages, from different households. But if we want to live in a space where we're all happy and content and having the same access to resources, then we have to be able to listen to each other. We have to be able to empathize with each other and talk to each other in order to move forward. And I think that sometimes because of our history of that inequitability just being like stemmed in our history, it becomes so much harder in reality to have that dialogue or like even start the dialogue, because how can we talk about equity when there's histories of inequity? Right. So that's why when I was running, I did mention, obviously, I'm a part of the South Asian community. I am a woman of color. I am a survivor. But in regards to all of that, I'm going to be an advocate for the Black community, for the Asian community, for the Fly community, the Latinx community. I want to be able to be a part of those conversations and be your friend and work with you. It just becomes harder when those individual communities or individual groups or individuals themselves aren't ready to have that conversation or that dialogue.
And I tell you that if you look into the history of any social movement, you'll see that there are group dynamics, there are systemic dynamics, and there are individual dynamics, and they all come out to play. Kevin, one thing I would love to hear you address is this, there's one of the core questions about the generation of college students who are with us now. In my view, I have found that our students across the country are far happier advocating for people who are not in the room than advocating for themselves. Insofar as it's meant to be a statement of community rather than a statement of I need or I want. And so I find some of the most passionate and morally and ethically committed statements I hear from our students come from that place of not everyone can be in the room. Yet social media appears to put everyone in the room together. In your field, I mean, you look at film, you look at all kinds of media. Could you talk a little bit about that tension between the communities we make visible socially through Twitter or Instagram and so on, and the communities that are enacted through life together?
That's a really great question. It actually brings me back to the first class I taught here at Pomona. The first class I taught here was a class called Media Temporalities. And it brought together a remarkable collection of students. So it was my first encounter with Pomona students. And I was absolutely stunned. I knew that I was going to be getting a student body or students in my class that were remarkable in terms of their capacity for critical thinking, for articulating strong arguments, articulating firmly held beliefs. But I was unprepared for the level of sophistication that I encountered with this first group of students. And one of the first things that really stood out to me was there were a group of really politically active students in this class, some of whom who actually were on the hiring committee for my visit when I first got here. I suspect that they probably, once they realized I was going to be teaching here, they're like, oh, wait, he's here, let's take this class. Doesn't matter what the class is, we'll just take it anyways. And so there were a group of really politically active students in this class. And precisely to your point, what I found so remarkable is that the students, almost at risk of their own personal gain, were willing to advocate on behalf of other students and other communities at the college, regardless of whether or not it would actually benefit them or not. And the way that this actually, I think, if we put this into the context of the pandemic, and just as we were entering lockdowns and closures, one of the students in particular in this class emailed me. And as you might recall, there was a moment in the early part of the pandemic when we were trying to figure out how teaching was going to work out, what we were going to do with our classes, how do we move forward, that there was concern about inequities with respect to grade distribution. And one of these students, one particular student, and I think there were a few other students from this class, but one student really in particular, who was in this media temporalities class, who had already made it clear to me that they would advocate on behalf of others at risk to their own gain, sent me an email and said, Professor Wynter, I'm really hoping that you will come on board with an initiative that I'm trying to move forward, which is a universal A for everyone this semester, the first semester when we were entering the pandemic. And what I realized is the student actually had already graduated. And this was her first semester, like, post-graduation, but had taken it upon herself to come back to make sure that everyone got an A. And that commitment to the Pomona College community, even after graduation, taking the time out to make sure that she was actually remained connected to the community, remained connected and engaged and was continuing to advocate on behalf of the students that she had been, she graduated but then didn't leave the students and her colleagues and community behind. So that was one of the more remarkable things that really stood out to me in terms of thinking about how students or individuals can advocate on behalf of others, at risk to themselves or without absolutely any profit to themselves. And so that's one experience in terms of at the individual level. To your point, I think social media tends to flatten this curve and tends to homogenize this idea or this sense that advocacy is this really sort of flat kind of field in which there's very little kind of hills, peaks and valleys. And so I think part of this has to do with just the way in which social media platforms tend to be organized. the algorithms that govern them, and ultimately how, for the most part, these platforms are advertising delivery vehicles. And so the point ultimately is to homogenize the experience as much as possible so that things all appear to be relatively the same and relatively flat. So with respect to how advocacy plays out, to me it's actually a bit of a minor miracle that some of the really more forceful and potent social movements that have developed out of social media platforms in response to police brutality and in response to racial inequity, that they've managed to take, the force that they have, given that the platforms themselves aren't really structured to produce this kind of response. So that's one of the more fascinating things I find about how social media has functioned as a kind of launching platform for social advocacy responses to the things that we are experiencing in our daily lives.
Yeah, finding a way. I think of two conversations this year where I've been fortunate to have, one with Reverend Barber and one with Imam Latif, about the ways in which they were called to organize their communities when in-person action was not possible. And when I was talking with Imam Latif a few weeks ago, the idea that funerals had gone up 6x in New York City was just so heartbreaking when you think that in the Muslim faith, you have a religious requirement to have someone buried within a particular amount of time. And to sextuple that amount, and then that's what they raised money for. Or Reverend Barber thinking about voting rights and how to get people active. One question that I'd like to ask both of you to think about and to discuss. I have found in my own experience that we can be more convinced of our arguments made on behalf of others than we are of our arguments made on our own behalfs. And one way of thinking about this is community and solidarity. And another way of thinking about this might be something like self-righteousness, or owning somebody else's experience, or thinking you know better than they do. So when we talk about advocacy and the differing values of advocacy, especially within communities where you don't know everybody's history, what are the different strategies we can take to approaching the sense that advocacy may not always be what you think it is, and what you advocate for may not necessarily be the best answer, no matter how well-intentioned you are. Go back to the grade issue. I know many students who felt that somebody saying because they were low income or a person of color, they needed extra help was frustrating. Or other students feeling like if they were applying for law school or grad school and they needed that grade, that taking it away from them was hard. And then students who are saying, this stinks for all of us. And it's just, nobody signed up for this, which none of us did. So, and that conflict was very real for a lot of students. It was very painful for a lot of students. So I throw that out. Just any thoughts you have about how we think about these challenges where everybody is trying to do the right thing. I don't believe anybody was trying to do the wrong thing or trying to hurt anybody or trying to punish anybody or anything. It was just hard.
Hershey?
I think doing your own research on an issue is always the first step. I think and you mentioned this as well.
Spoken like a true liberal arts student.
I have never done research in my entire life, obviously. No, I mean, I think, as you mentioned, when it comes to social media and like flattening this curve, we often, as we know, using the term echo chambers, we're often like put into these echo chambers, and for the lack of a better term, I'll say echo chambers of advocacy, is you end up being, because of algorithms, centered around the same dialogue as your peers. And so as a result, in thinking of co-opting just what your peers are saying and what your students are saying as your own movement, that often gets fueled even more through social media, because you just take everything that's being said as like correct and right. And that in itself can be very problematic when you don't commit to the principles of what's being shared or what's being reshared, which brings up the conversation of what performative activism is. But then also on top of that, I think it's really easy to reshare a post. It's really easy to be a part of the conversation through social media without knowing what the conversation is. An example of this would be, I remember that there was a post circulating, I think during the summer, in regards to something in India, a case in India. And I was confused as to why everyone was circulating this and saying, this is a big deal, our government needs to pay attention to this, our government needs to pay attention to this. So I went to my grandparents and I asked, hey, so what's happening with this? Is there anything we can do? And my grandparents at the time said, this case is like a Supreme Court case. This has nothing to do with government jurisdiction. We have no control over it, essentially. But then I looked at the date of the post, and it was like posted 7 months prior to the summer, which then made me so confused as to why everyone was just sharing this without knowing what it was even talking about or the timeliness of it. So because of all of that put together, I often, whenever I see a post on social media, unless it's a mutual aid request, then I usually, that's a community response. I usually respond to mutual aid requests. But when it comes to just things that are going on in the world, conversations that I'd want to be a part of, I usually take a moment to do my own research before I reshare something. I tend to do personal activism. I tend to donate to organizations, or if I don't have the funds to do so, I go into my community and I educate. A lot of the way that I view activism is through education. So I'll sit down with my rather conservative family and explain to them, this is what's happening. I will go into larger communities. I'm currently outside of Pomona. I work as the operations coordinator part-time for a group called Clancy Street that specializes in conflict resolution. So a lot of our conversations there have to do with restorative justice, informal resolution. How do we talk about that? And then on the side of that, I also am working at a nonprofit for restorative justice on sexual harm. So I'm working with sex crimes experts to build training modules to train people on how to properly conduct restorative justice. And that's how when I think about, okay, what does a progressive future look like? How can we build community and how can we heal trauma? I often think about restorative justice, and that's where I take my activism and my advocacy.
Restorative justice, a huge topic in and of itself, but the idea that those who have been harmed can feel whole or can approach wholeness by dialogue with those who caused the harm. And this is a principle Pomona College tries to take to our judicial processes, but they should be educative, right? It's not always about punishment. Kevin, what are your thoughts here about how we balance all of these things?
I think the question of advocacy, especially in the context of how we approach advocacy through social media, or to put it another way, how advocacy has changed in a highly networked technological landscape. One of the things that I find very striking about how advocacy takes shape in under a kind of social media regime is, I think, something that you kind of pointed out here, Hershey, is you really have to be diligent about the things that you advocate for, because oftentimes there will be information that gets disseminated through social media platforms where you might say, this is something that has a personal effect on me, something that I wish to advocate on behalf of. And the information you might be getting may not, in fact, either be timely, true, or based in fact in any way, shape, or form. And one of the things that, especially when you look at the way in which, if you take a look at this from a kind of far sort of right-wing, and it can be far left-wing or far right-wing, but if you look at it sort of an extremist view on this, that the information that oftentimes gets disseminated on the extreme left and the extreme right of a particular issue oftentimes tends to distort facts beyond recognition. And what ends up happening is, in distorting facts beyond recognition, oftentimes what it does is it ignites a response in a certain demographic that might inflame that demographic more so than just being presented with the facts as such. And so what ends up happening is you have people advocating for ideas that are completely untethered from reality. So one of the things that I find striking about advocacy in the age of social media is that oftentimes advocacy becomes mobilized around ideas that aren't actually grounded in facts or reality. And because information proliferates the way it does in this age when there's so much information available through so many different platforms at any time, any day, anywhere, that there's less incentive to actually do the research that you described. There's less incentive to stop and say, wait a second, this might not actually hew with reality. Let me take a step back and see if what's happening here is actually the case. People, I think, because we are such a splintered society at this particular moment in time, well, we've always been. I think it's just a little bit more visible and legible now. But because we are so clear about how divided we are on so many different issues, that when we see, whether it's a post, whether it's a meme, whether it's some kind of form of a blog that gets shared, and it reinforces ideas that have become sedimented for us personally or a group around us, or a particular idea that we see being shared through social media is really reflecting an idea that we've taken hold of, we are ready to throw in with that idea without stopping and saying, well, wait a second, there may be things about this that are true, there may be things that are not. So on the one hand, I think that advocacy is transformed in a way where there is, I think, less interest in seeing whether or not the things we are advocating for are actually attached to reality. And then two, the way in which I think there's less incentive to actually, to do the research to see if what we are actually throwing our weight behind or the things that we are becoming attached to are actually grounded in reality. There's less interest to do that research. So those seem to be the two kind of phenomena that really seem to emerge for me in terms of social advocacy and social media intersecting.
It's really interesting to hear your view on this as a media scholar, Kevin. I was reviewing some notes that I took, and really everybody, the best way to write a long paper or a book is to take your notes, reread your notes, highlight your notes, code your notes, distill your notes for the topics that you care about. One of the articles that I was looking at was a motivational neuroscience analysis of how people look at positive or negative views that match their political affiliations about an individual. So, if you hear that somebody you politically support did X and it doesn't match your view of what's right, how hard do you work to be exculpatory? And the big answer in this work was that it came down to what a lot of behavioral psychologists and others think of as arousal, which is an emotional dimension. How much does this activate me? How strongly do I feel about it? How much does this put me on alert? And the more arousal you feel in that general sense, the more likely you are to take discordant information that doesn't match I want to believe the best about my candidate, the more likely you were to be able to integrate the negative information without changing your view.
Right.
And so it's very much the sense of, it's not just the research, which it is, but it's also what we as human beings are willing to work for.
Right.
And to work hard to change your own mind, which is what many of us need to do, myself included, all the time. I don't think I know everything.
Right.
I know I don't. If I did think I knew that, my 2 children would just truss me up and toss me in the backyard, and I'd learn it pretty fast. But that sense of it's human to find it hard to change our views.
And not just change our views, but I think that there is this kind of innate feeling we have that once we've come to this initial decision about something, and I mean, in essence, it is changing your mind, but it's once you've come to this decision that I'm going to align myself with a particular view, or I'm going to adopt a particular point of view, even if that point of view that is being adopted hasn't been reasoned all the way through, once that decision has been made to adopt that point of view, going back, in some ways, it's almost as if you're being traitorous to yourself. It's really hard to admit to oneself that the initial moment of me aligning myself with this point of view was wrong, and so now I'm going to have to go back and recalibrate from the beginning. And even when it is absolutely clear, I can't tell you how many times I've had discussions with people where in the course of the discussion, you can see that they're like, you know what, maybe I should take a step back and actually rethink this. But because a discussion has taken on a velocity of its own, stopping and saying, you know what, I will go back actually, and this isn't going to be an ego thing. I will go back and actually maybe I need to revisit this thought before I actually go all the way with it. Instead, in fact, it is actually the opposite response, which is that rather than stopping and taking a step back and saying, okay, maybe this does need to be reasoned through a bit more, it's doubling down and going all the way through. And that is, as you say, I think that's a part of human nature. And
it's hard. I don't want to get caught in a naturalistic trap of saying that human beings, we are a certain way. But there's a lot of evidence that shows that we have inhibitory, when it comes to reward, when we make a choice, we feel like it's a good choice or a bad choice. And a lot of our neural networks are dedicated toward inhibiting that choice, right? You want to make a good choice because the cost of making a bad choice about a lot of stuff is really high. But once you've made your choice, the cost of changing your choice, you don't have a lot of I've got other things to think about. I already decided that. Thank you very much. I'm now on to the next thing. The incentive to re-inhibit, that's even hard. That's actually hard neurally to think about how that happens. I'm gonna switch. I'm gonna do something slightly unfair. Hershey, I'm gonna call on you second.
Okay.
Because Kevin is a scholar of media and interpretation, and I'm gonna read aloud a poem.
That's absolutely fine.
All right. So the lead up to this is this sense of re-visualizing things. And we get caught up in seeing these same things over and over. We've already decided about them. Often, we're given them in a frame in which we're encouraged to make a choice. That's what art does, right? It says, this seems like the right path. Deal with it. Challenging art does that more loudly than other art. So I'm going to read from a poem by Van Jordan, a Pushcart Prize winner, extraordinary poet, who has a whole book of poems called The Cineast. And it's about taking moments in film, in important films that he saw as a child, as a young man, as a grown person, and representing them. And it's a very old genre, ekphrasis, which means I'm going to give you a verbal description of a visual experience. So I'm going to read to you a little excerpt from, it's longer than a little, it's 10 stanzas. But it's about the Spike Lee film from 1989.
Do the Right Thing.
Do the Right Thing. And it's about a community torn by racial violence. So I'm going to read it out loud. And the great thing about being able to do this conversation is you can think for a minute. But Kevin, you're on it. All right?
I'm on it.
I'm going to read it very clearly. Do the right thing. The days were a skillet on a red-hot eye of a stove. The men on the corner, the couple in their apartment, the kids playing under a fire hydrant's relief were all sitting, loving, or playing in a skillet. Heat rose off the assonance of summer language. Some called it music. Others called it fire. The days were a skillet, but the nights were a match, lighting the gas. No moon appeared, only steam rising off the sidewalks from the day. Feet danced on the skillet and smoke alarms sounded. Moths, fierce as kids at play on a summer day, burst from musty closets. People were evicted, put out like butter, sliding across the skillet's face. Most of us were outside by then, swatting bees, swatting flies. We outlived the lifespan of giraffes and cheetahs made for this weather, or we sat on our stoops, indolent but defiant, simply escaping the drama of our own lives. Even those indoors without air conditioning, we like to believe at least, escaped the heat somehow. Mookie, to cool her fire, melted ice cubes on Tina's nipples. Radio Raheem stole ink off Robert Mitchum's knuckles. He took the heat, too, casting love and hate into digital bling. When did Soul Brother become an anachronism too hot for an air-conditioned conversation? In Sal's pizzeria, bugging out bugs. Sal, why ain't no brothers up on your wall? Smiley, auguring smoke before nightfall, carried matches. The day is a skillet on a red-hot eye of a stove. Later, a cop has Radio Raheem in a chokehold. Later, we will light candles for Radio Raheem. If a man takes a baseball bat to another man's property, that's a skillet too. If a man throws a barrel through a plate glass window, others will follow. A Pyrrhic victory is a pyre of life possessions set ablaze to save lives. Catharsis is the moth's flight toward the flame, fluttering in the spotlight, or first fluttering, then fighting the power to flutter. But consumed by the heat until all we know of its shimmer is how one smolders to survive.
Yeah, that's a beautiful poem. I'm actually a big fan of that book, The Cineast. One of the things that I found most striking about that book when I first read it was how many of those films that he was writing about had actually influenced my development as a cineast as well. Do the Right Thing really stands out amongst those films for one particular reason. One summer, when I think I was roughly 10 or 11, somewhere around there, during this summer, my family didn't have cable, but I had a VCR and I had a TV, and I had a copy of Do the Right Thing. And for every day that summer, for about 2 to 3 months, I watched Do the Right Thing every single day. And so the first thing I think is worth saying is that to Spike Lee's credit and to the credit of that film, it never became boring. It was something that even in a way that I wasn't able to fully grasp or understand, I always found it compelling. Something always drew me back to the film. I recall being always excited to put the film back in and to watch the film again. So that's the first thing that I think about when I think about that particular poem. The other thing that I find really evocative about the poem is the way in which it's Jordan, right? The way in which Jordan captures the sense of heat. If you've seen that film, you know that Spike Lee's use of color in the film is really intentionally used to evoke the sense of heat. Whether that heat is, kind of simmering beneath the surface as tensions rise in the community over the course of that particular day, whether it's tension between police in the community, tension between Sal and his sons working in the pizzeria, and Mookie, and Radio Raheem and the rest of the people in the community. So the way in which I think Jordan captures that sense of heat, right? The tension. I think that the language that he uses is really evocative. One of the things I think is also really great about that poem is that at the beginning of it, it's not really describing the film. It's describing his own personal experience, how the film connects to and relates to his own experience with what the film evokes for him personally. And I think that really gets to the heart of, cinematic experience. If there's anything to really be commended about that book in general and that poem in particular, is that when we watch films and we interpret films, the goal ultimately isn't to produce some kind of like one-to-one sort of ratio with like the aesthetic experience that is before you. The process of interpretation is, particularly with cinema, is the way in which the images that you're watching become embedded inside of you. And then once embedded inside you, what does it do for you personally? And then how then do you translate what has personally happened to you into something else? In fact, to write a poem about cinema, to write anything about cinema that isn't sort of distanced and critical in the kind of like, the sort of film criticism, the kind of critical language we become accustomed to when we think about writing about cinema. To write something personal about film is actually a really difficult task, because what you're asked to do is to take something that affects you at a level that is so deep and so personal, oftentimes you're not able to actually access what it is doing to you, to then turn around and say, I'm actually going to sit down and try to access that, try to express that, also in aesthetic, through aesthetic means. I think that is the thing that's most striking, most remarkable about that. That is a very difficult thing to pull off, to try to take something that is so deep and so personal and so moving, of which all the films that he writes about must be, and then to take that and say that I'm going to now translate this into a different form of aesthetic experience. So what we receive ultimately is a kind of double aesthetic experience. It is the experience of not just the film, or hearing about the film, but Jordan's experience of the film that he's then providing to us through his own experience. And so that's really a remarkable achievement.
Kevin, I think you're spot on. And one of the things that I did tell you I'd read a poem too. I didn't tell you what poem, so thank you both for playing along. One of the things about this book that Van Jordan wrote is that it takes what used to be social media. Like what is it? We're in Big Bridges right now, which was designed for collective experience of an artistic form. And it was meant to be a social experience, right? And you pay for a particular kind of social experience where you sit, who you bring. But that sense of a shared audience has become very hard to achieve. Either we're fractured politically, or we're fractured by what we see, or the multiple media channels that come at us. It's very, very different from what it was when you were a kid and you say, we didn't have cable, but I had a VHS. Better than beta. But, I remember when there were 4 channels, right? It was PBS, NBC, ABC, and CBS. And then because I lived in the South, we got TBS eventually, and then CNN. But that was it. There weren't 400 channels and nothing on.
Right.
But that sense of a collective experience, especially, here, this poem, going back to where we are right now with the trial of Derek Chauvin underway. This is 1989 when Do the Right Thing came out. Rodney King was beaten in Los Angeles, and the trial was 1992. I was a senior in college. This was even 3 years before that, and now we're 1 year after this tragedy in Minneapolis, and not just there.
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. It's like a new shooting. It's a new like heartbreak. I'm a politics and theater double major. I am an empath, which is why I do theater, and then because of my empathy, I chose to do politics. I wanted to. My dad often makes fun of me because he's like, you want to change the world, and I do. But it's more than that. And as both of you were talking, obviously, my parents, when we think of old movies, we think of old Bollywood movies. So I have not seen Spike Lee's movie. However, what you were talking about and also President Starr, what you were talking about when we were talking about the collective experience and the power of cinema. I think, and I firmly believe this, that cinema, movies, and theater are probably the most powerful political tools we have today. I think that not only does it generate a collective experience, but it generates a disarming collective experience where people aren't actively going into a movie or actively going into a theater show knowing what they're about to see. They're expecting to be entertained. And through that entertainment, the amount of messaging through the different pictures, through the different casting, through visibility, through narratives that can be expressed in this manner is so powerful for our brains because, as you said earlier, we are, at the end of the day, human beings are very neurologically built humans. There are some things that we cannot change. They're innate to us. But through the messaging that we receive, that we voluntarily experience and join into, those neurological pathways can change and we can start having larger conversations. And so that's why I believe, I just believe that huge monopolies of for example, Disney, how Disney owns everything. I do think that Disney, through the way that it messages its characters, through the way that it casts, through the stories they choose to tell, can impact the way our country and also the world, because of how much soft power the United States has, thinks about these topics, thinks about the narratives we're putting out, and we grow together. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why Generation Z is the most active, and it's because we were the generation of media. And a lot of that media is not just social media, but it's Netflix, it's Hulu, it's the access to TV shows and movies that are at our fingertips these days.
I think you might be speaking to part of the reason why here at Pomona we've seen a huge spike in media studies majors. And part of that, I think, is a growing awareness of the power that media has, even innately, even before you take a moment to actually study media and how genres work, how the structure of narratives work in visual form, looking at the history of how cinema developed out of magic show attractions and sideshow attractions into a kind of narrative art form, how it adopts the visual language of painting, sculpture, how it takes all of these things together and puts it together into this really potent and powerful experience. You're absolutely right. I think that, it'll come as no surprise for me to say that I think that cinema and moving image media is one of the most powerful tools we have for conveying thoughts, conveying ideas, conveying experiences. And to your point, I think one of the things that I find really important about the experience that you can have watching a film or watching media is its capacity to produce shock. And one of the things that I try to do in my classes is to expose students to films and expose students to media. And this is a fine line you walk, because it can go well and it can go wrong. But to try to produce that sense of shock, all of the most powerful experience that I've ever had, whether it was as a film studies student at the University of Toronto. Just to give you a really quick, to the point anecdote, I remember taking a class called Race and Representation. I think it was like a second year class. It was my second year studying film. And the first screening that year was Spike Lee's Bamboozled. And I had never seen anything even remotely like it. And I remember being so enraged. I couldn't even explain to you how enraged I was watching this movie. And that sense of shock and sense of rage actually mobilized something in me that made me want to learn more about why it was I was so enraged, what made me so angry. And I never would have been able to have that experience had I gone into the class and the professor said, you are about to be shocked and prepare yourself to see this because this is what's going to happen. I would have in some ways been prepared for that. There is something about media and cinema and moving image media and the stories it tells, its capacity to produce shock in a way that I don't think really any other kind of media form really has, whether it's just the written word, whether it's just a simple picture on a wall. There's something about moving image media and its capacity to shock that I think is a really powerful tool for producing political consciousness. And so I think you're spot on with that.
I would say from my neuroscientific perspective that sighted individuals are most practiced at you have senses because you need to act. That's why we have senses. And our visual sense, what we think of as our visual sense, is actually multimodal, right? It's sound, knowing how far away you guys are from me when you talk, even though I've taken my glasses off and I can't see you very well. My knowledge of what's behind my head, even though I can't see it. My sense of movement, smells, all of those get integrated into what we primarily think of as a visual image. And so cinema does take that power of multimodal imagery and then does things with it we're not prepared for. One of the things that I think is most important for me as a college president, as a professor, I'm teaching a course this semester where I've been trying to work on ways of doing behavioral psychology around the arts. And so we watched 2 film clips, lots of problems with the research. You have to deal with that. But one of them was a really cartoonish violence movie clip that my students detested, except for one who'd seen it several times in elementary school. I was like, what were you watching, child?
How did that happen?
But they hated it. And it was just like, no, never show us this again. And then there was a kind of sappy Pixar award-winning short clip and we got continuous measurements. So I ticked them off 5-second intervals and they rated their emotional intensity. Very messy data. But the variety of that, the power of it, the way people ascribe their emotional responses to a variety of different things. Was it disgust that was driving me? Was it humor that was driving me? Was it anger that was driving me? All of those things are hard to dissociate from one another. But it takes me in some ways to why we're here on a college campus. And there's a lot of talk, less than there was a few years ago, but still a lot of talk. I mean, in Iowa right now, there are robocalls saying that colleges are indoctrinating students. Please stop. You're pushing this agenda. There's no free speech on campuses. We've seen on our own campus that people don't feel free always to voice their opinions. For me, I feel like art is a way out of this. because artists feel free to shock. They're not trying to be kind to you about a lot of what you feel. They're trying to be true to you about what they feel and what you might or might not feel. But I feel that the arts, whether it's poetry or film or theater, are so important to what we do as human beings, that's so much part of whatever freedom we can claim. Because we can't claim freedom about the stuff that happens to us. We often can't even claim freedom about what we feel free to say. But when you're taking a courageous stand that is an artistic stand, I feel like there's a lot of power to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me personally, my own investment, or my first investments in the American horror film, comes out of really a small group of films that were made in the early 1970s through to roughly the late 1970s. A small body of work that was being made by filmmakers that was, really politically engaged, whether it was through either metaphor or analogy, but very much politically engaged, and was doing so in a way that meant to really shock, that was really in its own way attempting to shock a population into a certain kind of consciousness, whether it was, around the anti-war efforts that were emerging in the early 1970s, whether it was around, social justice movements that were starting to become increasingly mobilized, around, Black power, feminism as it started to really gain traction in the 1970s. So it's the films that were made at the time were, I think, in and of themselves, I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is one of the great American films, like one of the great independent American films of all time, for so many reasons that I won't bore you with at this particular moment in time. But
you told me all about them during your interview.
Oh, yes, I did. Yeah, I did. So you can see that my commitment has remained. I've remained committed to this idea. But these films, they had a capacity to shock, and they did so in a way that was using the artistic means that were available to those filmmakers at the time with the budgets that they had, and it was committed to a certain form of political consciousness. And it's one thing to say that you are going to make a film, and whether you state this explicitly or not, to say that you may have some intention behind advancing some type of political agenda, but to do so in a way that flirts with the idea of actually making your message unappealing by actually pushing away the audience that you hope to attract, that playing with that line, it's a really dangerous line to toe, but those films managed to do it perfectly. And so I think that there is a bit of, when I have students come into my horror class, I'll get questions about, have you seen this movie and this movie that just came out and this movie that just came out? And in some ways I'm ashamed to say, well, no, I don't really watch too many horror movies that have come out recently. My interest in horror films in some ways only goes so far as those films that are able to generate a certain level of shock, and to do so in a way that causes you to think, whether it's about how violence operates within a particular society, why these particular films at the time in which they were made, what they were trying to make reference to, how they shock us into thinking about other problems and ideas that are not contained explicitly within the film. That's really as far as my interest extends. It doesn't really go too far past that. So,
but this is also why you're a deconstructionist critic, to a certain extent.
To a certain extent, absolutely, absolutely. So yes, I think that the ability for art to marshal shock and to do so in a way that causes us to have to really think in ethical and moral terms is one of the really great powers of moving image media, cinema in general.
I'll say two slightly flippant things, which are normally when I say flippant things really aren't. One of them is I can push you into the 1990s on the political frame of horror via Fatal Attraction.
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay, so the 1990s also had some stuff. The second slightly flippant thing is I have been obsessively rewatching the movie Warriors recently, which is about a gang war based on the Odyssey, based loosely on the Odyssey in New York, that involves a roller skating battle royale in Union Square Station, 2 blocks from where I used to live. But I filmed with gang members. It was extraordinarily controversial at the time. It was filmed all between midnight and 8 a.m. over like 60 days in New York City. It's specular violence in terms of it's spectacular. It's meant for you to look at it. But it also, is this meditation on human beings and how everyone tried to come in peace, and then one person destroyed it for everyone else. And it's not a horror film per se, but it is that sense of an anarchic world that we're forced to inhabit, and how people try to escape it but can't. So both of you have talked a lot in very clear ways about the different forces that bring us together and can pull us apart. And I would just ask you to say a final few words about how we can be together without losing ourselves, and how we can be together without negatively compromising our principles. Hershey?
I think in thinking about answering that question, I think the first thing that comes to mind is always just, I've had this philosophy growing up where if I was going to do something, if I was going to go along a certain path, I was going to have a reason to do it. I wasn't just going to do it because the people around me were telling me to do it. My parents were like, this is what's going to get you into a good college. I was going to do it because it's what I felt was right and what I wanted to do. And I think when thinking about ways that we can come together without losing ourselves, I think that self-reflection of who is it that I am and what is it that I want to contribute to the world is something that I think everyone should have, because as Professor Jessie Mills once told me, who's this wonderful theater professor at the Claremont Colleges, and she tells all her students, is that you and yourself, like, that is enough. You and yourself are powerful, and you and yourself is enough. And that is something that I think of when I think of like not losing ourselves, and making sure that we stand together, we stand in solidarity, and we listen to each other. But we always understand that we, as a human, have value. Having your pack is also really important for that. And the last note that I've been thinking about a lot these days that I do want to say is that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the right voice. It's just not. I've really started to feel that way around campus, especially now that we're all on social media all the time. But I think that once we leave campus and we go out into the real world, that saying of the loudest voice isn't always the most right one. I think that really resonates with me and will continue to stick with me. I mean, not to be too political, but Donald Trump was very loud, and I disagreed with everything probably he said, so.
Operation Warp Speed. I'm glad I got those 2 sticks in my arms. But I feel you, Hershey.
Yes.
It's easier to be loud than to be right. Mm-hmm. And it's easier to be loud and right than to be loud and admit you're wrong.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Absolutely.
Kevin?
That just as an aside, that reminds me of I was cleaning out old photographs from a folder that I had on my desktop, and I had a meme that I had saved, I think from when I was in grad school. It must have been like the birth of memes. Like it was one of these, it was like a Jeopardy meme, and I'm not going to. I just saw it once again, so I'm not going to be able to remember exactly how this plays out. So, but the meme basically was like someone had given an answer, and it was the right answer, and so the caption reads, "Janet, your answer was the right one," but the character was Kevin actually. "Janet, your answer was the right one, but Kevin had said his wrong answer louder than yours, so we're going to award the points to him." And so it's so funny that you would end with that remark, because I just found this meme like 2 days ago, and I thought it was really funny. I think that's a really beautiful observation, Hershey, and I'm going to build off of your observation. I think what this time apart from people has done, and I think that it has both a positive side to it and a negative side to it. Having spent so much time with ourselves, it has forced us to do a certain level of introspection that I think some people have profited from and have felt to be rewarding, and might, moving forward, be transformative for the way in which they move through the world and engage with the world. And I also think that there has been some introspection done, and I know from some friends personally, where they have maybe seen things that they weren't so pleased to confront, and it has compelled them to have to, I think, rethink many things in their lives. So the time that we've spent apart, I want to think, and this is going to be my my sort of optimistic view on this, excuse me, I think the time that we've spent apart will ultimately, though it doesn't seem to be the case with the way in which we see the world through how it is depicted in social media, which, by the way, I think, especially if we think about the way in which the world is depicted through media and its obsession with depicting catastrophe, it can present a worldview that I don't think necessarily reflects exactly how we engage with and interact with each other. But I want to say that the time that we've spent apart ultimately will have a positive effect, where we have taken time to really think about what's important to us, to think about what we are willing to live without, what we need to have in our lives to continue to sustain a life that we think is fulfilling and happy. And I think that when it comes time, which I feel like we're approaching now, to come back together collectively, that we will do so really as better versions of ourselves. And I want to really believe that. And I think that when we come back to campus, that, I think that we will have better versions of ourselves. And so that's my optimist view, even though in some ways I'm a kind of nihilist, especially I think in my work. But I think I'm at a point in time when the positivist in me wants to believe that when we come back together, it will be as better people. And so that's how I'm choosing to see how togetherness ultimately will play out once we come back together.
I love that. I love what you both said. I'm going back to fairy tale of not Disney, but Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. We'll see who we all are soon. And there's a lot that's good that we can see reflected back and not just off of a Zoom screen.
Absolutely.
I'll say to everyone who's joining us, this conversation could have gone on for another 2.5 hours. We were having a really good time because I've missed very much talking to my colleagues, to my students, and just feeling that sense of shared wonderment and engagement. And I'm so grateful to both of you for sharing this conversation with me and with our community, because we needed it. We need more of them. It's going to be a hard year ahead as we come out of this isolation to try and figure out what it means to be together. And that the two of you came to help work this through means a lot. So thank you. To those of you who are watching us, thank you for joining us for this series of dialogues. This has been an extraordinary year, and I hope you found these conversations meaningful and uplifting, because I have, as much as they can be painful and activate these things that can give us pause. They've restored my faith in a lot of humanity. If you missed any of them, you can find the recordings on our website. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the semester. Have a great evening, and find someone you love and take a moment of joy, because we'll all be together soon. Good night.